with Chapter 6, this is going to be a very brief overview of the material. We're still talking about the cardiovascular system, but really focusing on the blood that the cardiovascular system pumps through the entire body. So here are your chapter objectives, and you can read through those. But starting off, what are the functions of blood? All right, the blood is moving throughout the body, and so it's providing transportation to oxygen, nutrients, wastes, to get the wastes out of the body or to the places where they're going to be pulled out of the blood. Carbon dioxide is going to move from the cells that are producing it through their basic metabolism over to the lungs, so the lungs can get rid of the carbon dioxide. And then hormones. Hormones are simply chemicals produced by different glands, but by definition, those chemicals then have to move through the blood to be a hormone. And then defense. Within the bone marrow, you have different cells that we'll talk about briefly in this chapter, but then in more depth in chapter 7. That are going to provide defense against pathogens, bacteria, fungal organisms, viruses, and just basic dirt, and provide healing for cells that are for injuries. All right, then there's regulatory functions in terms of helping to maintain body temperature, helping to maintain the water-salt balance, and then body pH. Body pH in general, but really more so with blood pH. So the composition of blood. Blood is a fluid connective tissue. All right, we mentioned that. I don't remember, back in chapter 1. Oh, maybe it was chapter 4. Talking about the different types of tissues, and blood was a connective tissue, but it's fluid, it's not solid. Inside blood you have plasma, and that is where you're going to find the water, and you're going to find the salt. Then there are plasma proteins that you can pull out when you, say, donate plasma. And then there's the formed elements. The formed elements come from the bone marrow. These are your red blood cells, your white blood cells, which are going to provide defense, and then the platelets or the thrombocytes. Those provide the ability for your blood to clot if you have a cut, if you have an internal injury. If you didn't have platelets, then your blood would never clot, and you could bleed to death because all of your blood would move out of the vasculature and either internally into some cavity or externally if you had a major trauma event. So plasma proteins are extremely important in terms of helping to maintain the water content in the blood, which is going to help maintain blood volume and then blood pressure. The three major types of plasma proteins are albumins. This is just a pretty basic protein. Albumin is also a protein of high concentration in egg whites. And then there's the globulins. Those are the antibodies, which we will talk about in chapter 7 as being produced by plasma cells and helping to aid in defense. And then fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a protein that is going to help in the process of platelets forming blood clots. So where do the blood or the formed elements come from? All right, they're going to come from stem cells. And you all have probably heard of stem cells. Those are going to reside in the bone. And from stem cells, you have the different white blood cells. All right, the lymphoblasts. All right, this is kind of an intermediate type of cell. If you think about the stem cell, even though it's the origin of all cells, you can think of it as the baby cell. Here are the teenagers or the young children, and then here are the adults. All right, so you have the stem cells that form all types of cells, It depends on what signal they get, and depending on those signals, they turn into different precursor cells, and then those form the actual adult cells or the mature cells. So you have the platelets, neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. These are important for defense, but different types of defense. And you have the monocytes, which are going to be phagocytes that come in and eat foreign material, bacteria, viruses, all those good things that are going to cause problems once they get inside of you. You have your lymphocytes, which are the B and T cells. We'll talk about that more in chapter 7. And then your red blood cells. All of these originate from the stem cell. All right, the structure of red blood cells is very important to their ability to transport oxygen. In figure 6.3a on the left there, you see a very pretty picture of red blood cells. And this is not actually our cartoon rendition of the red blood cells, but that's actually what they look like. And if you have a very good microscope, you can, and a good sample, you can see that they look almost like donut peaches. And that donut peach look, or that donut shape, gives them more of, or a greater surface area. All right, that surface area is important because you're going to have oxygen moving across the plasma membrane of those cells. In the middle, you have the hemoglobin molecule. The hemoglobin molecule is what's going to actually carry the oxygen. And you can see that in the middle, you have an iron molecule. So again, where iron is important in your red blood cells is it's part of that heme group, the hemoglobin. You have 4 different heme molecules that come together with the iron to form hemoglobin. And that also represents the ability of one hemoglobin molecule to carry 4 oxygen molecules. Now, in one red blood cell, you have as many as 280 million hemoglobin molecules. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen. So each red blood cell can carry over 1,000 million or a billion molecules of oxygen. That is huge. All right, and then over here on the right side, you have a capillary that shows how small the capillaries are, and that each capillary, or the capillary, is only about the width of a red blood cell. And so therefore you have a lot of movement, or a lot of ability for exchange between oxygen in the red blood cells, CO2 in the tissues that the capillaries are running through. All right, another important molecule is carbon dioxide, because that is a byproduct of our cellular metabolism. And so carbon dioxide needs to get removed from the body, and that is done as it is picked up by the red blood cells, moving back into the lungs. All right, the important thing to note is that if you aren't able to get rid of the CO2, it stays in the blood. And I really like this figure. It's used in a lot of other courses, but what we want to focus on here is that when you mix carbon dioxide with water, all right, carbon dioxide being formed in your cells, water already being in your blood, those two molecules form carbonic acid. Now, if you are having problems breathing and you're not getting rid of enough carbon dioxide, then you're going to have acid being built up in your blood. And now your blood is not the proper pH, and you can become acidic. And that's not good. So you need to be able to breathe properly to get rid of the CO2 to help maintain proper blood pH. And so now there's where you have the connection between the respiratory system and the blood, or the cardiovascular system, in helping to maintain homeostasis within the body. Production of red blood cells also occurs in the bone marrow, but it's going to have the help of kidneys. All right, the kidneys, if there's low oxygen in the blood, they're going to be stimulated to produce what's called erythropoietin. The erythropoietin is then going to move to the bone marrow to help stimulate the stem cells to move to to making more red blood cells. And then red blood cells are produced. Those levels return to normal, which means the oxygen levels return to normal. And so then the kidneys will stop producing erythropoietin at higher levels. All right? Kidneys helping to maintain homeostasis within the body by producing erythropoietin. And this is also important. Red blood cells only have a lifespan of about 120 days. So they're constantly being destroyed or dying off at low levels. And so the kidneys are constantly going to be producing small amounts of erythropoietin to keep that process going. All right. Some different disorders associated with red blood cells. You have anemia. All right. This is a very important disease. It can be caused by a variety of different issues, but anemia in general is just a condition resulting from too few red blood cells or too little hemoglobin inside the red blood cells, and so you simply don't get enough oxygen being carried throughout the body. And you can be very fatigued, you feel run down, you can have a pale color to your skin. All right. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic form of anemia. And what happens here is that the hemoglobin molecule, because of a genetic disorder, doesn't form its shape properly. And without the proper shape, it doesn't carry enough oxygen. It doesn't bind the oxygen as well. And it doesn't allow the red blood cell to form its shape. And so then consequently, the red blood cells don't move through the capillaries the right way. They become stuck in the vasculature, and you have problems because you end up with blood clots, you end up with a lack of oxygen to your tissues. All right, then hemolytic disease of the newborn. This is a condition with incompatible blood types that lead to the infant's body attacking its own red blood cells. And this can happen in utero before the infant is born and then continuing after birth. This can be controlled by the OB/GYN physician who is looking after the mom during pregnancy. All right, with your white blood cells, we mentioned this. Those are going to be derived in the bone marrow. They are large cells, and their main function is to fight infection. All right, and we're going to talk a lot more about these in Chapter 7. Some of these will only live for a few days. Some will live for months or even years. So red blood cells, this is what they look like. We're not going to focus on that. But do look over their function just briefly so you can have an idea or a very basic understanding of what's happening. How are you protected against different infections or different scenarios? All right, disorders involving the white blood cells. All right, one is called SCID, or severe combined immunodeficiency disease. This might make a little more sense after next chapter, but with SCID, a person inherits this disease and they don't have any white blood cells, right? They don't have the B cells and the T cells. They can't fight infection, and they succumb to infections very easily. Leukemia, this is part of one of your assignments for this week. It's a group of cancers that affect the white blood cells. Mono, all right, this is caused by a virus that infects B cells, and this is a pretty common disease in teenagers. All right, platelets are going to be involved in clotting, and this is where we're going to have to end for chapter 7, but move through or chapter 6.